It is not a secret that sociology overwhelmingly leans left politically as a profession, in terms of the sensibilities of its practitioners. Does this have an impact on the scholarship? In the social sciences, researchers face the extra difficulty of having to prevent their moral intuitions from skewing their conclusions and their interpretations, and also the hypotheses that they are willing to entertain. In this sense, as my guest Mark Horowitz and I agree in this interview, the social sciences, rather than the natural or the formal sciences, are the hard sciences. They are, in this respect, more difficult, because they are concerned with topics that mobilize our moral intuitions. Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Mark Horowitz. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you for coming. And so you are now Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton University. You received your PhD in 2004 from the University of Kansas, and the title of your thesis was Attitudes Towards Wage Fairness in the Maquiladora Zone, Social Identities, Reference Groups, and the Sale of Labor Power in Mexico. Your research has covered topics such as wage fairness, power relations within a capitalist economy, and also sociological controversies. And to boot, a few months ago, your article Sociology's Sacred Victims and the Politics of Knowledge, Moral Foundations Theory and Disciplinary Controversies, which you wrote in collaboration with colleagues Anthony Heine and Kenneth Kickham, was published in the American Sociologist. And so this article will be the central topic of our conversation. And I will start by asking you maybe a very predictable first question, which is, what drove you to carry this type of research, to carry out this research? I'm wondering, is it simply that you were noting that many people tend to see scholarship in sociology as biased, at least to some extent, by the political sensibilities of its practitioners? And so you just wanted to test that claim, or was there another reason to that?
Yeah, that's actually a big question. And if I go on unduly long, just interrupt and I'll pause a bit. Right. The motivation behind it has a number of different threads. I guess I could speak to the very first paper I did, because there's a larger project here. The Sacred Victims piece is like the latest one. But the very first one was actually a survey also of sociologists, which was called Whither the Blank Slate. And just by way of personal biography, I come out of a critical sociology tradition, critical theory tradition at the University of Kansas, where we were able to read the classics. I spent a lot of time reading Marx, for example, in graduate school. And when I got my PhD, I started teaching at a university in South Texas along the border where I had carried out my dissertation research. I had a colleague of mine who would ultimately turn out to be a second author on that paper, William Jaworski, who would raise a number of questions regarding evolutionary theory with me. And he would challenge me quite a bit. And when I started to pose what seemed to be fairly plausible ideas to my colleagues from graduate school, my former mentors, I noticed there was strong opposition to it, a lot of discomfort, and I noticed a lot more heat than light in terms of the kind of reactions that they had to these ideas. And I remember personally that I really identified as almost a total constructionist when I was in graduate school. I was never a constructionist with regard to sexual orientation. I always felt that was like the grand exception, that there would be this biology to that. Okay. But for other sorts of behaviors, I either assumed or never problematized that they were purely a function of socialization. And then when I was encountering these kinds of biological arguments, and I posed it to my colleagues and friends and encountered such opposition, it was rather kind of bruising opposition, to be honest with you. It led to a lot of alienation. It sort of awoken in me this concern for how ideas are not simply ideas, but ideas are markers of your values, of your group identity. And then with the rise of increasingly sharp political polarization in society, it just ignited this kind of interest in exploring maybe other fields also, not just sociology, but anthropology, economics, and others, maybe these paradigms that we witness in these various academic fields are not simply frameworks of assumptions or intellectual tools, but they're actually markers of deeply held moral values and sensibilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's not a secret. I think going into this last article, Sociology, Sacred Victims, I'm pretty sure that you knew that you were going to find that a very large majority of sociologists tend to lean on the left politically. This is not really a mystery, but I suppose one of the main questions was, does this sort of, quasi-uniformity hinder the quality of the scholarship, right?
Yeah, well, let me back up on that, because I think you're right. We certainly knew that there's overwhelming liberal left overrepresentation in social science. It's been widely observed.
Yeah.
What we didn't expect in all of the papers, and it's probably most dramatic in the Sacred Victims piece, we didn't expect to see such a pattern by political orientation, though. So what we found, and I'm sure you noticed in looking over the work, what we found is that the further you are to the left predicts where you stand on particular policy positions. And as you move toward the middle, because there's virtually nobody in the political right in my field, as you move toward moderate, you systematically see greater receptivity to particular kinds of hypotheses or questions. So, and that we found not just in the sociology piece, we found it dramatically in an anthropology piece, which will come out this year, and an economics piece as well. So what's going on, I guess I would step back and ask, and that's where we provide the data, we demonstrate how scholars' political orientation is the best predictor of where they stand in particular controversies in their field. And then we, albeit speculatively, bring in moral foundations theory, this social psychological school associated with Jonathan Haidt and others. But to circle back now to your original question, how it affects scholarship, I think it does, because what it creates is it creates interpretive communities that share certain moral sensibilities, that police certain kinds of hypotheses. So when a scholar hears an idea, they're not just hearing the idea in the abstract. It's already understood through the lens of a particular group identity. Particular scholars might be deemed as outside the sort of pale morally to even raise and discuss. And that can lead to alienating experiences of students who may not share the same liberal left sensibilities. And it harms scientific progress, I think, altogether when we have these echo chambers in academia.
So maybe we can go a little bit more into the details of the study. So I will just read very briefly a short description of your methodology. So you surveyed 479 sociologists in national universities, so meaning in the United States, right? National universities and colleges in the US, well, it's written here, regarding 3 sensitive controversies. So these are urban poverty in the Black community, gender differences in occupational choices, and immigration. And the way you sort of obtain this sample of 479 sociologists is that you compiled a list of all sociology programs in the US. So you used publicly available emails, and you sent about 3,500. You sent the survey to about 3,500 people in sociology faculties throughout the country, and you got a 14% response rate. And the 14% who responded allowed you to build your data set. And so something which you clarify several times in the paper is that you were aiming to understand how academic sociology works as a group of people with its own internal dynamics, and this is something which you already mentioned a minute ago. And so you were more interested in understanding than in pointing fingers and lecturing people about their own biases. This is maybe something that is interesting to note. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that or if I should continue. But
no, it's actually quite important. I come out of critical sociology, so I was trained in a sense to be noticing the normative or political or ideological aspects of mainstream social science, right? And I did it rather unreflectively when I was in graduate school. It was just sort of the agenda that was at hand. But in today's climate, where you have so much political polarization and demonization between different kinds of groups, I just don't find it particularly helpful to just wave a flag and say, listen, we're the smart group. We see the world clearly. You guys over there are blinded by your ideology and bias. I think that just helps nurture intergroup antagonism to frame it that way. So on a sincere level, don't get me wrong, I don't hide from my points of view. I will share them, and we do in the paper, as we do in the other papers when necessary. But that's not our principal goal. What's interesting, though, is because we're diagnosing a phenomenon where knowledge is almost inherently tribal, that it's impossible to even claim, to try to even be outside of tribal claims without being accused that you must have an agenda. You must, you obviously, because again, if you're entertaining certain kinds of hypotheses as plausible, so just to bring up one from the paper, you just mentioned one, but like the thing that got former president of Harvard in trouble, Larry Summers, right? Yeah. Could there be an on average difference in the brains of boys and girls and men and women that could, in interaction with socialization and discrimination, could that lead to the kind of gendered economic landscape that we witness in society? I think among a particular, and I think it's a relatively small fraction of sociologists, many of the radical ones, that even asking that question is kind of revolting, and it's kind of policed out, and it means you must be somewhat sympathetic to the argument to even be raising it. And so, again, I have to go back just to speak to my personal biography again. I was hearing certain sorts of ideas. I was recognizing them as being controversial. When I was raising them for clarification, I would get a lot more emotion than I would get explanation. And that maybe I'm a moth flying into the light or something, but I'm attracted to what people are so sensitive about. And when I went through that myself, I wanted to figure out where the rest of the field was. And that really kind of opened up a rabbit hole, because then I discovered, wow, on all these debates across various social science fields, politics ends up being the best predictor of where social scientists stand. And I wanted to go further than that, though, because a lot of times people will say, oh, yeah, of course the libertarian economists think austerity is a good thing, and the radicals think capitalism is collapsing tomorrow. That's their ideology. And I'm sort of dissatisfied with that. It sounds tautological to me to just say, well, the radical sociologists think this and the moderate ones think that because that's their ideology. It doesn't really get at what ideology even is. And that's where we speculatively bring in social intuitionism or moral foundations theory associated with Jonathan Haidt, this kind of evolutionary approach to understanding how people's politics is really a reflection in part of certain inherited emotions that we have. And this is yet to be worked out. There's a lot of psychologists doing work in this, but I think it's the right terrain to be in to figure out ideology in connection to evolved emotive tendencies.
Yeah, it's a very interesting avenue of research. That's for sure. So of your sociology colleagues, you asked three, I guess, families of questions, or three series of questions, if you will. The first series concerns sociology's moral mission. The second series concerns advocacy and objectivity. And the last one was about specific sociological controversies. We can discuss maybe each series briefly. So, for instance, you asked your colleagues whether sociology should be both a scientific and moral enterprise, and here 2/3 of the respondents agreed with that statement. You also asked, for instance, if they support, quote, Marx's dictum to change the world. Of course, but the audience hopefully will know that there is this famous sentence by Karl Marx who said that, I'm just quoting from memory, but philosophers so far have only interpreted the world, and now the task of philosophy should be to change it. Something to that effect. And so 62% of sociologists agreed that this should be at least one of the tasks, I guess, of intellectuals, and only 15% disagreed. So now if we go to the advocacy and objectivity questions, there are broadly the same numbers of people, of sociologists, who agree and disagree that a dispassionate attitude in research is important for accuracy. So a few more think that it's important to be dispassionate than those who think that it's not so important. And this is one example among others. So I don't know, what can we say already from these first two sets of questions in your view?
Yeah, well, the spirit going into those questions was to examine whether sociology's commitment to these moral and normative goals would end up predicting where they would stand on the controversies as well. Because even though political orientation is the best predictor, we didn't know that yet when we were developing the survey. So we were looking at things like where they stand on these kind of moral mission questions, where they stand on questions of objectivity. And what you can expect would be the case is the case. And when we get to the controversies in a minute, I can unpack this in a little more detail. But you were giving the aggregate numbers, like where sociologists stand on this question. But rather interestingly, when you break it down by self-identified political orientation, what you'll see for those questions as well as for the controversy questions is a kind of stairwell. So we asked all the respondents to identify as either radical, liberal, moderate, conservative, or libertarian. And as I know your listeners know, the word liberal in the U.S. context is really social democratic in Europe. So when we asked them that, so just to give you an example, we had a question. I don't think you just raised it here. Like, would more political conservatives benefit the field of sociology, right? And then we found that of the radicals, 14% agreed with that. And then of the liberals, 28% agreed. And then the moderate, 49% agreed. So this kind of stairway where you start to notice a difference by political sensibility is really interesting. You had mentioned Marx's famous dictum, philosophers merely interpreted the world in various ways, right? Points to change it. Well, 84% of radicals agree with that sensibility, 65% of liberals, and then only 32% of the moderates. So something is going on across these sorts of questions. Same thing holds with dispassion. If it's the moderates, almost 8 out of 10 of them are going to say, of course, we need to be dispassionate. And then less than 20% of the radicals agree, though, that we need to be dispassionate. So you have differences of opinion about what we're doing as social scientists, which I think reflect our deeper moral sensibilities. And what I'm sort of bringing to the table, and my colleagues and I are bringing to the table, particularly for those who I have to say I share this progressive sensibility, I need to be aware, and our community needs to be aware, that committing ourselves to these values does have implications for how we see the world. It doesn't mean we're necessarily wrong, although I think in a number of different cases, sociologists have been dogmatic because of their moral sensibilities, and we can talk about that when we get to the controversies. But just I think everyone along the spectrum has certain sensibilities. We tend to join in interpretive groups in academia that share, not necessarily consciously, but we gravitate to people who share the same sensibilities. All of a sudden, we're using the same analytic tools and arriving at the same empirical conclusions about these highly sensitive controversies. And I think it's important for a level of sort of meta-awareness about the role of politics, and then to try to explain it and not just condemn it in an intergroup way, but try to really understand it. And I'm not claiming I have the be-all and end-all explanation here. It's rather speculative, but it has a high degree of plausibility in my view.
Okay, so we can go and focus on the controversies, the specific controversies now. So you singled out 3 questions, or at least 3 problems, if you will, which you posed to your colleagues, and you asked them questions about whether some hypotheses concerning these problems might be interesting or worth exploring at all. And so the first controversy. So please tell me if I'm explaining these problems wrong. But it was about the poverty rate among blacks in the U.S. and whether the sort of African-American culture was or could be possibly a factor in explaining the sort of difficulty in having this poverty rate really drop throughout the years, right? because the decrease is, I suppose, pretty slow. And so that's the first controversy. Then there is the question of whether, biological factors can explain, to some extent, occupational choices that men and women make. And the third problem is the question of whether immigration can sometimes have effects that can be genuinely perceived by some people as nefarious, or at least to some extent worrying, or if it's always automatically, beneficial to the places that receive the immigrants. So I summed these up correctly, right?
Yeah, I could, I suppose, just add a couple of brief details to frame it. There's been this ongoing question of the perpetuation of poverty, particularly in inner city communities, affecting the African American community. Earlier in the century, there was this attention to what's called broadly the culture of poverty. And the basic idea, if you go back to the history of culture of poverty thinking, it's the idea that dire economic circumstances lead to situations where poor people develop cultures that adapt to those circumstances and sort of make a bad situation even worse. And there's a certain logic to it. I don't think the early culture of poverty, like Oscar Lewis, was critical of the poor in some normative sense. I'm just pointing out that it's not an ideal environment for people to sort of climb out of poverty. Certain cultural norms emerge that can exacerbate the problem. So we sort of returned to that question. I knew it was sensitive, because I remember encountering it in graduate school. In the 70s, there was strong rejection of it because it was perceived as kind of blaming the victim, that if there are any cultural practices that emerge at all that help perpetuate poverty, that the agency would have to be taken out of the hands of the subordinate group, and and the focus was on social structure, institutional racism, and the like. So I should make a really important point here for those who do get a chance or don't get a chance to read the article. We provide vignettes that are these kind of short overviews of the literature for the respondent. And we don't refer to specific authors, but we kind of frame what we consider to be the major points. So what we point out is that there's widespread consensus that institutional discrimination plays a major role, ongoing conscious bigotry, poor schools, unemployment, all of those social problems that intersect in the perpetuation of social problems in the inner city are real. But we just ask the question, could there be a kind of culture, an autonomous cultural force as well, at least it takes on some autonomy after it's been institutionalized, that then makes that bad situation worse. And what we find is that, again, I have to go back to the stairway. As you move from radical to moderate, you get more receptivity to cultural kinds of arguments, as well as arguments regarding the responsibility or agency. So if I can, let me know if this is okay for me to go on a little bit here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Interrupt at any time. So we asked sociologists if it's plausible that there could be cultural factors that play a role in the perpetuation of, it's not just poverty, by the way. We talk about out of wedlock birth, and I think crime might be one of the questions as well. And then we find that radicals, I guess in their defense, over half of them, 56% say that's plausible. And then liberals, 77%, and then moderates, 93%. So on that particular question, you see receptivity, I think, across the field. Now, of course, when we ask whether structural factors profoundly outweigh the cultural factors, right, we find that radicals 77% and liberals 72%. So they're open to culture, and in their qualitative comments, because we provide comment boxes as well, they say, well, we're open to it, but it's very minor compared to institutional discrimination, poverty, and so on, that perpetuates itself due to structural reasons. And then 37% of moderates agree that structural factors profoundly outweigh. So notice this, I'm fascinated by this political difference. As you move on the political scale, certain ideas start to become more congenial to you, or at least you're willing to entertain them. Other ideas you're not willing to entertain. So here's one that's rather controversial on this question. Let me make sure I get the exact. Solutions to inner city poverty include some responsibility among the Black community to address the problems of violence and out of wedlock births.
Mm-hmm.
So like if there's going to be solutions, there's some responsibility on the part of the African American community. It's kind of a normative question on some level. And then we find that 30% of radicals agree with that, 52% of liberals, and 71% of moderates. So again, question after question, we see a difference. What's going on? What is it going on? What's going on politically that leads radicals and to a lesser extent liberals to take the positions that they have with regard to these questions?
Yeah. You mentioned the comments, and maybe we can also briefly mention, or we should come back to that later. I don't know, but in the comments, you also got some very sort of angry reactions, right? I mean, so you provided the possibility. Not all of the respondents wrote comments, but provided the possibility below the questions for your colleagues to write comments regarding the specific questions, and some of them were quite angry. I mean, for instance, regarding this, just in reaction to the possibility being raised that, I mean, what you just explained, that there is maybe some, quote, responsibility on the part of the African American demographics for this continued problem of poverty.
Oh, no question about it. A lot of people reacted. I don't have the comments right in front of me right now, but the statements to the effect of, you are white supremacists. How can you even ask that sort of question? And then rather bizarrely reductionist views that you don't usually encounter among sociologists. Sociologists, we kind of take pride in the fact that our statistical models deal with all these variables and that intersect in complicated ways to explain outcomes, right? And then when it came to this question, some of the more emotive responses were like, culture is a byproduct of the structure. Change the structure, the culture will follow. These very kind of, I guess, I want to call them dogmatic because that's not the spirit of my mindset, right? But, just like this culture can't have any autonomy. And yet in most things that sociologists talk about, I mean, culture is this hugely important explanatory variable. And in this particular one, by fiat, it's eliminated. And what I try to do is I try to make the argument that, and again, not just waving the flag to say, why are you so dumb? But like what's going on collectively and emotionally. And I actually do believe, and this, I'm going to sound like I'm celebrating far left values here, but I do believe that there's a strong egalitarian shared sensibility among the far left, a concern for the vulnerable, and people, and also this kind of real strong suspicion about hierarchy. I know there's been a lot of discussion in recent months and years about kind of authoritarian leftism that you see on college campuses, SJW culture, but I actually think that's more an exception for most people that end up on the liberal left. I think the stereotype of the bleeding heart is a more accurate one that goes to the left, that people that aren't really comfortable with hierarchy, that really resonate with bottom-up democracy. I can talk about the SJW stuff if you want to get on that topic later, that's fine. But so I think what's going on in sociology culture, though, is among the radicals is just this strong shared sensibility. And to the extent that you're only interacting with other like-minded radical sociologists and others in the community that interpret the world through this lens, then it's arguments that there could be responsibility or that culture could play some even subordinate role they're not heard empirically, they're heard morally. You're justifying this. And we had, and again, I should say, by the way, this is a small subset, or maybe I shouldn't say small, maybe a quarter to a third of the kind of comments we got. So overall, we had lots of very respectful and reasonable and balanced comments, but we did get a subset of comments that were very angry, very emotive, that accused us of a whole litany of different things just by asking the question. And again, I'm not here to mock that or deride that. I'm here to say, this is what I think is going on collectively and emotionally. And if we can become more conscious of our shared tendency to do this, we all have a better chance of doing better science. Yeah.
Should we discuss the second controversy, you think?
Sure.
So just to recall, it concerns the question of whether there can be biological factors in men's and women's choices of professional fields and careers. And Yeah, in my view, the answers were even slightly more hostile to this hypothesis. I don't know what was your assessment of the answers, but that was my impression.
Yeah, and this particular one, this is where it was harder for me to resist trying to put my own point of view a little bit into the paper, just because I find my field to be, I just inevitably just find them to be further from the truth on this than on other questions. I mean, there's such staunch rejection of the idea that there could be any biology in the mix. And again, it's not particularly helpful. So yes, we certainly got angry comments that suggested that claiming there could be a biology to this is akin to, the way blacks were treated in the past, or, literally the word eugenics sometimes would be thrown out just to say these sorts of things, as if, and again, it actually speaks to the model that we try to explain in the paper, that people are not hearing these hypotheses as hypotheses. They're hearing them as moral statements. And therefore, people who raise them are expelled from that moral community and condemned. And I just don't think it does justice to the question. And just by way of personal biography, I remember when I was in graduate school, like I said a little earlier, policing this idea in my own head. It's like, of course there aren't any differences, between men and women beyond our genitalia. Of course, it's just a question of how you're brought up. And then getting presented with the research on it. There's a woman named Diane Halpern who wrote a pretty big book on cognitive differences in psychology. And in her introduction, she talks about how she came into it thinking that there wouldn't be these cognitive differences. But, eventually when you have the weight of this massive evidence, you have to somewhat step back and say, can I put the political sensibility to the side and try to see what the data say? It's easier said than done, though, especially when your identity and your values are so wrapped up in the kinds of claims that are made out there. Do you want me to give an example or two from the actual survey for the listener?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if I have the exact question here. So political efforts to increase women's representation in STEM fields, though desirable, may fall short of parity due in part to average biological differences. So again, let me go back to our vignette that I didn't mention on this one. We stress in the vignette that there's widespread consensus that socialization and discrimination play a role. Could there be another factor in the explanatory cocktail? Could these biological differences be interacting with the socialization and the sexism to lead to these outcomes? And let me see here what the response is to that. So 4% of radicals find it plausible. So we're not even asking if they agree with it. Set the bar pretty low there. So, and then 7% of liberals, and then only a quarter, 25% of the moderates. So the field as a whole is not really open. There's a lot of sensitivity around this issue, and we're not really open to this idea that biology could be playing some kind of role. Here we ask, on the other side of it, though, we ask, let's see, is it plausible that women's greater representation than men in people-oriented professions, such as social work and nursing, is due in part to a biological component? And here we do find, it's still pretty low. 16% of radicals think that's plausible, and then 35% of liberals, and then 39% of moderates. So yeah, in this particular issue, on question after question, we find a lot of kind of impulsive, knee-jerk kind of rejection of these sorts of hypotheses. And like you had said earlier, Vincent, a substantial number of people expressing highly emotive, in some cases hostile, kind of reactions to the questions.
It's out of the three problems which we explored, it seems to be the most volatile, so to say. I mean, the one eliciting the strongest.
Yeah, we probably threw professional caution to the wind, right? Even investigating it. I just received tenure, by the way, at Seton Hall. So just like this semester.
Well, congratulations.
I don't know if I'm thankful that maybe they didn't read my articles too closely, or whatever might have happened there. But I'm just interested in it, and it strikes me as a plausible. If we think, again, from an evolutionary lens, if we think from, some of the data on cognitive ability suggests that, women tend to outperform, or girls tend to outperform boys on, verbal skills, facial recognition, certain kinds of communicative tasks. And then boys end up outperforming girls on spatial rotation, right? And things that could make sense from a prehistoric sort of hunting and domestic kind of binary. And yet again, it's strongly policed, and it's like this can't possibly have a biological component. And I find that to be more emotional and again linked to this collective instinct that I share, by the way, as a progressive. I share it. But just through a lot of thought and a willingness to sort of try to be open-minded, not to again be self-aggrandizing, because it was a painful thing. Coming to terms with these hypotheses was painful in my own biography. So it's hard to do, and people don't like to do it. And a lot of people are more comfortable being in their sort of echo chambers, right, that reaffirm how they feel about the world.
Yeah, you've mentioned differences in abilities between the sexes. I found that. There's also differences in interests that have been documented, and even discussing these. Even if I think James Debierre, I'm sure you're familiar with this episode. In his memo, I can't remember for sure if he mentioned only very briefly differences in capacities or abilities, or if he didn't mention them at all. But certainly he focused most of his discussion in sex, about sex differences, on differences in interests. This dichotomy of women having more interest in situations involving people and emotions and trying to deal with feelings and reacting to people's feelings, and men having more interest in analyzing situations, sort of, reading them as systems, this type of dichotomy. Even not discussing abilities, but just interests, elicits very strong reactions.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is the bigger piece of the puzzle, this inclination towards interest. And we do cite literature in the paper that demonstrates that. If you look at interest inventories around the world, the kinds of careers that men and women will tend to gravitate toward, you do find that again. I know the peril of the anecdote, but I happen to have an advising role here at Seton Hall, and I just very distinctly remember a student from a couple years ago who had a female student has a physics scholarship. She came to my office and says, well, I have to be an occupational therapist. I'm like, but you have everything ahead of you. You have the scholarship, what's going on? And she just and it was just, the reason I remember it is because it just so speaks to this. She's like, well, I have to work with people. I just can't. I can't be in that world my whole life where I'm just thinking about systems and things like that. So I know an anecdote is not particularly scientific, but I think there's a wide literature to support, though, that this, and we should both hit home hard the prise on average.
Of course,
these are average differences that we see. These average differences we see between men and women that make a certain kind of plausible evolutionary sense. And then going back briefly to the more controversial question of abilities, I'm sure you're familiar with the data showing that men will be sort of overrepresented on the less capable end also. So it's like you have men, it's kind of a more polarized bell curve, right?
Yes,
so
men are more extreme.
Yeah, more extreme. So then if you have a very small number of people on that very high end, that could help explain why, the physicists and the engineers. And again, we in the paper are very clear that there's a wide-ranging literature on socialization. There's a wide-ranging literature on discrimination. We weren't trying to say that that's wrong, although our goals in the papers aren't to take a position in these controversies. Yeah. It's more to show how people's positions link to their values and their politics, right?
Right.
So we do acknowledge that, but we just ask the question, could biology be part of the explanatory cocktail as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this was not popular. So maybe we can move on to the third controversy. This concerns immigration. I suppose you had in mind to the United States, or maybe to Western countries in general, this type of third world, so to say, to first world migration typically. And so you were asking your colleagues if, to the extent that a part of the population in the United States is either outright hostile or maybe simply sort of skeptical or not so convinced that immigration is a good thing on balance. So you're asking if maybe there was some understandable reasons for concerns about immigration.
You're exactly right.
Yeah, and so here, there's also more hostility than sort of openness, I suppose, to this hypothesis. Although arguably a bit less than on the question we just explored of biology and sex.
No, you're absolutely right. We ask a number of questions bearing on it. And what we were trying to get at is this question of cultural cohesion and whether a progressive or very permissive immigration policy could have any downsides to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and again, I should say that part of this, the moral foundations theory of Jonathan Haidt suggests that people on the liberal left end of the spectrum are much more, or I should say, much less inclined to a kind of group loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, and there's psychological evidence also talking about openness to experience, openness to new ideas and new people. I would say xenophilic, kind of a love for diversity.
Yeah.
And then if you're xenophilic and you love diversity and you cherish it as a value, then maybe that collectively, if you're in an echo chamber of people who share those values, maybe it's going to blind you to the idea that there could be some drawbacks that have a certain degree of legitimacy among mass publics. And I could speak to my own biography on this. I remember when I first heard some of these arguments in graduate school, I was always trigger ready to find, no, immigrants aren't a drain on the welfare state. And I was just ready to defend the immigrant before the data even came in. And I don't think scholars should be in that space. I think scholars have to be in a space where they're looking at the data, they're trying to appraise a controversy. So we asked a cluster of questions about immigration. Here's one. Is it plausible that calls to limit immigration sometimes reflect legitimate moral concerns for cultural unity and shared identity, and not solely economic anxiety or racism? And I think to a large extent, people with liberal left sensibilities were so morally committed to diversity and vulnerable groups that you can't be against it unless you're a racist, unless you're hateful in spirit. So it's sort of inconceivable. Let me see, I have the numbers here. So 21% of radicals think it's sometimes legitimate, like there could be culturally legitimate reasons to limit immigration. And then 43% of liberals, and then 54% of moderate sociologists. So so the field is not super open. There was a number of different comments that you might have seen in the paper where, anybody who is ever opposed to immigration are kind of racist. I think someone said hillbilly or something, and all other sorts of disparaging kind of language. And again, I don't say that in a spirit of criticizing them for that, but I say it in a spirit of it's not helpful when you share these values that are out of step with the rest of the public, and it blinds you to certain kinds of hypotheses. I think this is actually the most disturbing one probably in the study, because we asked them, should policies be informed by potentially disruptive effects? So it's a very, let me see if I get it. Immigration policy should be informed by research on its potentially disruptive effects on social cohesion. So then it's we're not even saying it does it, but should we at least inform policy with data about what the consequences would be if we brought in large numbers of people from different ethnicities and so on? And then it turns out only half the field agrees that policy should even be informed by it. And that's disturbing, because that's a large number of people who are basically saying, I don't care what the data says, it's a good thing. And we had a number of sociologists say that in their comments. They said, I support research into disruption as long as it shows there's no disruption.
Yes.
It's like we pointed out in the paper, it's like you're putting the cart before the horse.
Well, there were these striking comments according to which policy should only be informed by the data if the data is agreeable to the normative sensibilities of the one or at least a few individual sociologists had wrote comments to that effect.
We did have one question in Europe about Muslim migration to those countries potentially threatening the Western values of human rights and gender equality. And then is that plausible? And 6% of radicals, again, a vanishingly small number, think that's even plausible that it could be a threat. And then 7% of liberals, essentially the same number, and then 29% of moderates. So the field deeply shares this kind of xenophilia, which, again, I plead guilty. I share the same value. But it's created a sort of echo chamber among them, a kind of groupthink that won't entertain these kinds of hypotheses. And then for those who raise them, at least some subset of the field, and we can't our data doesn't enable us to say how many in the field, but it's pretty clear that it's on the more radical end. There's a subset of the field that will demonize and essentially tribalize any kind of claim that could even raise questions about whether immigration could be harmful or not. So that's the general gist of the controversies there.
Yeah. And so there's one more. There's several more things which we can discuss, but one that comes to my mind now, which is that I think maybe only one sociologist wrote this, or several. You can clarify that they wrote that they tend to self-censor. And when I say tend to, I should say they say that they do it all the time, actually. Meaning that maybe on some of these questions they agree with the sort of, quote, politically incorrect, unquote. At least they agree that this disagreeable hypothesis should be considered. But this person, at least I remember one, wrote that they feel unsafe to say so, and this also very much resonates with what you what you were saying a few minutes ago, because you just said that you got tenure and you suspect that maybe your last article, the one which you are discussing now, maybe it wasn't read so much. You hypothesize that had it been read more closely by the committee which decided that you should get tenure, then maybe you would have been in trouble. I don't know if that's what you... I guess that's what you meant, right?
Yeah, highly speculatively. I happen to be in a very fair-minded department here, so maybe even if that were the case, it wouldn't have been a problem. But I can imagine certain universities were much, much more social justice oriented, that police these ideas with a greater degree of intensity. It would be a sort of tenure suicide mission to even ask these sorts of questions. And from the point of view of knowledge production in academia, what are we doing when we have classrooms where students raise questions that they might feel, because of their own family background, their own moral sensibilities or political sensibilities, they may watch right-wing media, and they might have plausible hypotheses, and we may end up shaming them or policing that out of classroom discussion as well. So there's a whole array of themes that progressive intellectuals don't like to talk about. And what I'm trying to do in my work is get beyond the kind of critique that we see widespread in society today of the left and of left academia, to try to better understand it. And I'm also trying to be on the other side. The reason we don't do studies of right-wing academic groups is because there really aren't any. I went to economics, and I thought economics would have a large percentage of libertarians, and it turned out in my survey they were only about 13 or 14% of of the field, and that it turns out economists are largely liberal and moderate in their point of view. So even that one field where I would expect to see more right-wing sensibility, we don't see. So there is this relationship. I think there's a whole bunch of factors, and people have written about it, about why academia has become so left liberal predominant. And there's a guy named Neil Gross who wrote a book that puts a lot of emphasis on self-selection. I think that's most of the story. People that gravitate to academia have certain psychological characteristics, as well as, I would say, moral and emotive and political sensibilities. But I'm not saying there's no discrimination that could play some role in that as well, in hiring committees and so on. But I haven't investigated the question close enough to know.
Yeah, again, it's important to stay open to all the hypotheses on that question too.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that statement by a couple of the respondents. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were a number of people who said, I think one said, I just bite my lip. And I don't say these things. There was one respondent on gender who said, it really came across as a kind of moral confessional. The respondent said, I guess I should come out of the closet and admit something like that I think hormones and biology could be playing a role here. Wow. So that sort of language, I think, inadvertently reveals the climate of self-censorship that does exist within the field. And again, I think you'd find different sorts of moral communities are going to police different kinds of ideas on the political right, maybe not within academia. And I think so everybody can benefit both on the left and right. And it just benefited me, turning to this kind of body of research benefited me a great deal, because when I became aware of my own biases through my own career, when I became aware that I engage in this kind of policing of certain ideas based on my moral sensibilities that I shared with my interpretive group, it made me more accepting and kind of begrudgingly sympathetic even to people who might just be in a different place on the right. And be able to listen to them more. So I like to think I don't hear anything in a tribal way anymore. Like I just hear the argument. I like to think that. It's probably naive to think I completely do it, right? We all engage in some confirmation bias, but I'm much, much closer than I used to be. And I consider it my ongoing mission to sort of encourage this. We value objectivity. Most social scientists will say we need to be objective. There's a subset of radical sociologists who don't think dispassion is important, right? But most say we value objectivity. I think one really important way to get to objectivity is to be aware of the emotions that we probably have even pre-wired in our brain. So this is a biological argument I'm making, that play a role in nudging us toward particular interpretive communities that then create echo chambers that reinforce our shared values and make it even harder to be objective, because then these kinds of empirical claims are seen in a tribal way and they're seen as immoral, not just empirically wrong.
Yeah, this brings to my mind the thesis that Jonathan Haidt defended in his book, which, well, I can't remember the title, but his famous book about moral intuitions.
The Righteous Mind.
The Righteous Mind, exactly. Yeah. Because he was saying that, according to what he's read and what he's researched, we tend to have these intuitions that come to us, sort of straight away when we are confronted to a question, and much of our reasoning is, mobilized not in order to arrive at a objective or sort of factual response, but it's mobilized to defend this initial intuition that we had from the beginning.
You're absolutely right. That's a really good summary of his core argument. He uses the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, and the rider, is more or less subject to the emotional elephant, and we just use our brains to just sort of rationalize and justify what we feel to be true. And I experienced that in my own biography. If I hadn't sort of transcended it to some extent in my own life, I wouldn't have gotten interested in this topic and done all these academic surveys. But to the extent that these questions are controversial, it means they're tapping into underlying moral intuitions and emotions. I don't think you'd expect to see this as much in the hard sciences. Now, I think you'll find it, like Thomas Kuhn famously wrote about, these scientific revolutions. So you do find people committed to paradigms. Because if you spend like your whole life around a certain technique, for example, or if you care just because your life was committed to it. But that's different than the kind of social science arguments that I think tap very deep reservoirs of emotion in society. But it'd be interesting. I haven't done any within it. We did one of evolutionary anthropologists, but that's as close as we came to the hard sciences in our surveys.
Yeah. For sure. There's always, even the hard sciences are a human activity, so there will be biases playing a role, but the advantage, what makes the hard sciences or the natural sciences easier in a way. I tend to see it this way now, is that I carry research in physics, so I see it as easier because although we can make mistakes and we can sort of have pet theories and we can prefer our ideas to other people's ideas, it's not likely that we will have these, that we will get hijacked by moral intuitions. It's very unlikely, certainly in mathematics, physics, chemistry, geology. So this is an advantage, so to say, of the natural sciences.
Yeah, it's a common observation, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. To point out that the soft sciences really are the harder sciences for precisely the reason you just highlighted, because we bring all of this to the table. We bring all of these moral intuitions to the table, our political sensibilities to the table, even before, and even the concepts we use so often kind of bake into them. Like a common concept in critical sociology is oppression. But notice how oppression, is that empirical? Is it moral? What's going on there? And we have difficulty disentangling oftentimes the empirical claims we're making from the moral claims we're making. And so that's certainly kind of the terrain that I'm operating in, to try to be clear on that.
So to draw a conclusion, at least statistical conclusion from this article. Maybe we can discuss a bit further after that. But to summarize the findings sort of quantitatively, is it? I mean, my own sort of reading of your findings is that there is this. I would call it a sizable minority of sociologists who seem to be, very very fervent in their politics, and this correlates with a sort of, a lack of openness concerning some hypotheses that they see as normatively disagreeable. And so an interesting question is, what is the size of this sizable minority? I would sort of just very, very coarsely looking at the overall results, I would place it at around maybe very roughly 1/3, but this is completely open for discussion. I'm just wondering what you think is the... we don't need, to quantify it exactly, because in any case, the boundaries are blurred, but, there is this staircase which you went back to several times, and there's always, a core group, so to say, which is sort of close to most of these disagreeable hypotheses. But how would you summarize with a few numbers, if possible, these various findings from your article?
Yeah, I think that's probably in the ballpark of accurate. I would say about 25 to 30% of the field that are, we use the phrase vulnerable group partial. Mm-hmm. And we actually mean it in a double sense. Like, they're partial because they see their mission in the field as, I'm defending the vulnerable and I'm fighting oppression. Yep, but then they end up being partial, like in the sense of like psychologically partial, like you can't see the evidence. So your vulnerable group partial, maybe about 1/4 to 1/3 of the field have that sort of sensibility. Mm-hmm. It's hard, though. It's hard to specify the exact like quantitative amount of each step in the stairway. We know that there's a correlation, but there's also some radical sociologists who entertain biology and some moderate ones that don't with regard to gender, right? So people are all over the map, but all that said, though, you still do see the stairway pattern. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty accurate summary, but 1/4 to 1/3 of the field. I think, but again, when it comes to the gender issue on occupational choice, I personally find, for what it's worth, that the field is really, in this particular issue especially, far off where we need to be in terms of seeing what I see as the facts. But again, that's not the main point I have in these papers, to mock my colleagues and say you're not seeing the truth, and I am, because I'm aware that I also engage in my own confirmation bias and everything else. But on that particular issue, a very small percentage of the field thinks it's plausible that these biological factors could be part of the story. So that's a concern to me from the point of view of science. So you have a couple things going on at once. You have an overall field closed posture with regard to certain politically unsavory, as they see it, hypotheses. And then you have within that field divisions of receptivity based on your political identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever come across this, but in my experience, and this is just from internet and social media, I've come across a fair number of people who seem to have, I know they have a background in the social sciences, or some of them, they just see the social sciences are pretty favorable because they think it sort of supports their sort of political positions. And some of these people can be very hostile if I say that many people in the social sciences tend to reject biological explanations. So they will say, no, it's not true. So sociologists are open to these biological explanations. And then every time they come across a possible biological, explanation, it's always partial, of course, but, some seemingly interesting hypothesis for a biological factor for social outcomes, they are invariably hostile to it. So although they, on the surface or sort of in the abstract, claim to be open to these hypotheses, in practice, I've noticed that they are always rejecting them, and very, angrily, in the same way that you notice in the survey.
Yeah, and in my life experience echoing yours. When I would start to bring up these examples and these hypotheses, I encountered a lot of heat and not so much light, and a lot of ignorance of the evolutionary argument. I've become more of a biosociologist, and it seems like the more strident a sociologist is in rejecting it, the least familiar they are with the actual writings. And they'll make very, just like we all do with the confirmation bias, they'll find some extreme statement made by some outlying evolutionary psychologist or something, and then claim that represents where the field is. And and the more that their claims were out of step with the literature that I was reading, and the more I was reading literature that was so fair-minded, and then I ended up kind of reappraising my own field. Right. A lot of the social theory in my field, not all of it. There's fabulous social theory in sociology, but there's also a lot of it that's so laden and dripping with kind of moral righteousness that I started changing the kind of narratives and literature that I started to read, and that only nudged me further along. I hope to seeing the world more clearly than I used to see it before. But on the gender issue in particular, lots of hostility. I think our data do show that they're not particularly receptive. So my paper can contribute to I guess empirically to that question. And then we had people, I don't know if you remember the comments, Vincent, but we had people say, I'm open to studying the biology. If only to disprove it, you can study it. One of them said, you can study it, and you could also study whether salad feels pain or whether fish retire. These very mocking, kind of dismissive. You can study this, but we all know it's culture. We all know we're blank slate. So, so sometimes on a survey, someone can say they're open when in reality, if you actually dig just below the surface, they're not open at all.
Yeah, what I've noticed is slightly different, really. I mean, it's more about among French speakers. And there's really, in practice, they reject all the hypotheses, all the explanations, all the interesting studies. And in theory, they still say, no, we are open to it. We are open to these biological explanations. And it seems to me that they are not. But anyway, so maybe we can finish by sort of discussing this quote that you have, which I think is interesting. I mean, this quote, this passage, but I will make it a quote towards the end of the article, because I think it's interesting and it's worthwhile, and it again supports your point that even though people's sort of normative intuitions can have bad consequences for research, and they can if these intuitions rarely encounter opposite intuitions, then it can lead to confirmation bias, echo chambers, these type of behaviors. So even though all of this is true, you emphasize the fact, and here I will quote you, that egalitarian instincts to protect the vulnerable are both a resource and a constraint in knowledge production. And you add that, after all, some of the most important work in critical social science has been animated by such instincts, by these egalitarian instincts. So it means that, they can still, sociologists can still be influenced by these instincts and carry out some good research.
Absolutely. I mean, I see, just to kind of speak to my own background in political economy, when I was in graduate school, I see the Marxian tradition, actually the humanist Marxian tradition, is being animated by extraordinarily important sensibilities. And this is where I would sort of flip the script a little on the right. There's a tendency among people that had a huge and positive impact on me. But when it comes to the economy, they're pretty comfortable not delving very deeply in the nature of capitalism. And they, like people like Steven Pinker, who I admire deeply, and Jonathan Haidt, who had a transformative impact on my thinking, who I really dislodged me from any vestige of blank slatism that I had in my worldview, and I'm indebted to that dramatically. But that said, though, and Haidt had planned to write a book on capitalism, which I'm sure he'll at some point return to, but he has a number of talks about it online where he kind of frames capitalism around a narrative. Of course, Steven Pinker talks about with good trend data showing how things have gotten a lot better, and that there's this discourse on the left, I think he's right, that's very apocalyptic. Poverty is growing all over the place, and then you look and actually the percentages of decline. And so I think he's hitting on something important. Yeah. But then I think the moral intuitions on the far left, just to go back to your question about the good work that can be done when you're so deeply committed to a kind of non-hierarchical world, and concerned about vulnerable groups. It led the Marxist tradition. I'm not saying the Marxist tradition is correct, but I'm sympathetic, just in full disclosure, to probing how value works, how profit works, how private property works. I mean, in Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which is a fabulous book, I'm pretty sure the word debt is never even mentioned. So can you have a conversation about whether capitalism is sustainable without some discussion of where debt is in the economy and where value is produced in the economy? Right. So all I'm getting at, I'm not saying this to wave a flag and say they're blinded. I'm just trying to flip the script a little and say other moral intuitions keep people from certain kinds of conversations that speak to the durability of capitalism. And that would be an example about how your willingness to really, really go deep on that question could be a reflection of these moral intuitions. So they can be a resource in some context by nudging you toward real deep investigation of particular radical aspects of the economy. But at the same time, my work now is showing they're also a constraint because they're highly moralized. They preclude certain kinds of hypotheses, right? So and I see that across the board. I see people's moral intuitions nudging them to particular kinds of truths. So everybody will have a kind of partial truth, I guess you could say. But then the more that we become conscious of this, the more I think we can build broader consensus around larger questions. If people are willing to say, I was emotionally going to attack you, but I'm not going to anymore. You know what I mean? I'm going to listen to what you say. Right. I'm going to understand you're in a different location. So that's kind of the hope. It may be utopian, but it's kind of the hope behind my all of my work on controversies.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very worthwhile project. And, well, you're not alone in this, of course. Thankfully, I think there's a bit of a wave, I suppose one could say, these days.
I think so. I think my work is part of a larger kind of shift in the zeitgeist. And a certain, I can't remember who wrote it. Maybe Chekhov. This is in this book by Moral Tribes by Joshua Green. People will become better when you show them who they are. So it's like the idea is here, there might be a shift in the zeitgeist toward more awareness of our tribal nature. If we become more aware of it, we're not going to allow ourselves as much, even though we're seeing it all over the place, don't get me wrong. But the fact there's this pushback now where people are saying, hey, let's put the brakes on all of this rhetoric, let's put the brakes on all of this intergroup antagonism and try to work toward collective understandings and solutions to our most severe social ills.
Sounds great. Let's hope that it can be, advanced. And
I hope so.
Yeah, I have good confidence that some progress can be achieved in that direction. Is there something else which you would like to discuss, explore, say before we stop?
No, I think I was able to. Thankful to you for having me on the podcast, and thankful to have the opportunity to sort of map many of the key points of the study, as well as this sensibility about not engaging in ideology critique so much as trying to understand where people are coming from. And I think we had more than ample opportunity to stress that. So I just want to thank you so much, Vincent.
Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast. It was really a great discussion and a great article as well. Actually,
well, thank you. Don't hesitate to keep in touch.
I will. So thank you very much. And
all right,
have a nice
thank you.
Afternoon and let's keep in touch.
All right, you take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.